Look, I believe in one simple truth. You don't have to be superhuman to be a superhero. There are heroes all around us. Heroes of culture, business, philanthropy, and technology. And on this show, I'm going to talk to them all. My name is Joe Anthony, and this is Hero Talk. Welcome to another episode of Hero Talk, where we talk to ordinary people doing extraordinary things, heroes of culture, art, community, business, technology, who all have one thing in common: they want to change the world. Today, I am extremely honored. I have an amazing guest that accolades are just too long to rattle off, but I'm here with an amazing photojournalist, my friend Stephanie Sinclair. How you doing, Stephanie?
I'm good. I'm
Awesome.
so glad to be here. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for coming. I really feel like the genesis of you getting here, and I use the word genesis a lot, is somewhat serendipitous, because I first came in contact with your work at Photoville in Brooklyn. The container museum that they do every year down there by, I think it's Brooklyn Heights, kind of in that area. And I think your container was one of the first containers I walked into, and I was just completely moved, completely blown away by what I saw. And ironically, we were running a campaign for a client around breast cancer, and I'm not sure how your name came up. I'm not sure if I threw it in the mix or our producer John did, but as soon as your name kind of came up, it was like, we got to work with Steph. I mean, she just has an eye for this subject matter, and now you're here talking with me on my new show, and I'm just extremely, extremely excited to have you here. One of the things that really kind of struck me about your work, there seems to be kind of a trend right now, and I'm not sure how much of a trend it is, because the stuff that you've been doing your whole career, around this kind of concept of kind of photo activism. Right? I'm not sure if that's a terminology that's thrown around within your kind of community and amongst your peer group. From an outsider looking in, looking at the work that you're doing, especially in the time in society that we're in, I don't think that there's more of a befitting term than kind of photo activism, because I really see that not only do you take the time to chronicle certain events around the world that people don't have an awareness of or a window into, but you're really doing this with the hopes of it sparking conversation that ultimately ignites change. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, people communicate more visually than they ever have.
Mm-hmm.
We have Instagram, we have, all kinds of different mobile, apps that are happening that people are constantly screening through images. So I think it's actually, photojournalism had a tough time in publishing, but it actually is never been a better time to communicate about issues through photography. So I agree. I think photo activism is a good word, and it's definitely what I think myself and many photojournalists are trying to do, because you're not out. You don't want to you're not a war tourist. You don't want to go to cover, the invasion of Iraq or what's happening in Syria. I mean, people are risking their lives.
Absolutely.
You don't do that for any reason but for people to help those who are living in these situations, to have their voices amplified and raised so people could hear them and understand what their needs are.
When's the first time you picked up the camera and knew that this is what you wanted to do? And when did you know that you wanted the subject matter that you focus on to be what it is?
Well, I mean, so, as we were discussing earlier, I was actually a poetry major, and I was a very bad poet. But what happened was my mom was a prolific painter, and she was actually kind of like a hyper-realism painter. And I grew up surrounded by art, and I wanted to do something that was creative, because I saw how much joy doing creative work brought my mother. And so, I kind of didn't make it in poetry, and I couldn't really draw stick figures very well. So I kept searching, and I really always believed that like real life was more interesting than anything I could make up myself. And so I had a friend.
Was there a moment that kind of epiphany happened for you? Like where you saw some real life subject matter that kind of turned that switch and said, that's what I want my medium to be?
I would say probably the first time I saw Donna Ferrato's work. She did a book called Living with the Enemy, and it was about domestic violence survivors. And I thought that photography was interesting, but I wanted it to say something. And that was the first time I understood that photography could be used in activism, could be used to engage people, to make them feel and be outraged. I mean, I was kind of always outraged, as a young person anyway. I mean, I still am. I mean, I think that, I don't know, I've always felt like we're as kind of as successful as we take care of those around us. And so
what do you attribute that to? Like, what do you attribute that kind of mindset? Where does it come from? This kind of passion and empathy and kind of desire to expose certain truths or use your medium as a force for good and change? Where does, you could have shot anything. You could have shot fruit, right? You could have shot beautiful models, like for Vogue and stuff. What really kind of made you want to use it as a force for humanity?
I mean, I think, my mom just was such a big influence on me. She used to say, don't judge anybody, don't ever say harsh words to people because you don't know what they've been through that day. And she always really instilled in me my mom was the most compassionate human being, and I'm much tougher and kind of with my words and things than she ever was. I mean, I still don't rise to her level of compassion and empathy for people, but I still try. And I think it just comes from being raised with someone who had limitless empathy for people.
Now, you went to University of Florida. Go Gators.
Yeah. Yeah,
Are you
great.
from Florida?
I am. I'm from Miami originally.
Oh, okay, Miami. All right, the land of, you got Sin City, and then you got Miami, and then you got this photographer who's developing this amazing sense of compassion and empathy. How'd that happen?
Yeah, right?
Were you a party girl in Miami? No?
No, I wasn't. And so I've always been, I was in the punk rock scene in Florida.
Okay.
I was not ever like a beach girl. I was not that kind of person. And
not the oof clubs.
No, it just didn't relate. And so I think that's why I ended up in New York.
Yeah.
I mean, I just didn't. Florida. But what's interesting is Florida's really like, such full of weirdos and stuff like that.
I mean, it's so transient. I mean, 80s, 70s, I'm imagining, is when you just started to kind of see things, obviously big time drug.
Yeah, big drug culture at the time. I mean, constantly.
How was that, growing up around that? I mean, were you exposed to any of it? Did you see
it?
Of
course I was. I lived from Miami. I mean, everybody knew somebody who was dealing drugs or doing something. I mean, this is how it was. One of my best friends, like my boyfriend was in rehab with her boyfriend who was a drug dealer. I mean, this is kind of just how things were in Miami. Just everybody was kind of in that world. But I was always pretty nerdy, and still kind of do-gooder, and I ended up on the kind of straightest, bandwagon for a while. And then, I really just still believed in I think maybe it's because in Miami I saw people kind of things not work out real well in a lot of injustice and what happens to people when things aren't right. I mean, a lot of the drug culture comes from poverty. Comes from people wanting to have more than they have.
So, went to University of Florida. Was your first major job after that at the Chicago Tribune?
It was.
Okay.
It was.
So tell us a little bit about your experience there, because from what I've read, they kind of threw you in the fire right away and was like, "You're going to Iraq." I mean,
well, not quite. Not quite.
Okay.
I got a job. I got a job working in the suburbs for the Chicago Tribune in the beginning, and I had like terrible jobs doing that. Like I had to photograph the beekeeper when it wasn't bee season and things like that. So, but then, I mean, I think that kind of stuff really you really cut your teeth on it because you learn how to make pictures out of nothing. And then, so when you do get into a situation that's extraordinary, like going to Iraq, like, dealing with the death penalty and prosecutorial misconduct and things like that, but that might be sometimes challenging, subject-wise or hard to get access to. You learn how to make pictures quickly in difficult situations.
Yeah.
So,
I mean, you started to talk a little bit about some of the work that you did while you were at the Tribune, and one of the things that kind of stuck out at me is the work that you guys collectively won a Pulitzer for, which was the work around the death penalty in Illinois.
well, that's not what the Pulitzer was for, actually. The Pulitzer was for a big project that the newspaper did on the airline industry.
Oh, yeah, that's right. Okay.
But the prosecutorial misconduct and death penalty story did actually lead to the governor putting a moratorium on the death penalty, which was pretty substantial, and that was one of the moments where I really understood the power of journalism.
Wow.
Because that's a big deal to stop many people from going, from who are on death row and having them have a new lease on life, particularly because so many people were there that their cases were shoddy.
So was that prior or before you were in the Middle East?
That was before I went to the Middle East.
Okay. So you had this, incredible experience in using photography as a medium, and you saw the impact it can have on really creating social change. You now go to the Middle East with this kind of mindset, of being able to capture content that could potentially, just reveal new truth. So what was the eye or the perspective that you were going to the Middle East with? What did you want to see? What did you want to capture? Was there a specific directive that you got from your editor, or it was like just go out there and shoot everything?
No, I specifically wanted to do the story on the Iraqi civilians, the population who's kind of stuck in this situation, and this invasion is going to happen. I went to Iraq actually a couple months before the war happened, and I got to kind of see what life was like under Saddam, and meet a lot of beautiful people. Like when I first got off the plane in Iraq, it was my first kind of trip to a place that was, living under a severe dictatorship. And when you get off the plane, it literally said "Down USA" in big red letters, and you have to walk over that to like enter the airport. And I remember being like, "Whoa, this is real." And then I went in to the hall to pick up my bags, and this guy comes over, and he with this beautiful smile, he comes over and he goes, "Let me get your bags," and he goes, "Welcome to Iraq, your second home." And then that really showed me immediately like how like one perspective that we have on something can be so different than what the reality is. And so I spent about 2.5 months before the war happened and kind of documenting daily life there, and really fell in love with so many people that I met. And that guy's name was Ala, and he worked with me for a couple of years. And we're still in touch. I mean, I just spoke with him, recently. So he's trying to come to the U.S. But we, this is a little bit of a tangent, but, I actually, got he and his family when the invasion turned out to be like a full-on war that lasted for several years. I got his family to Germany.
Wow.
So I definitely, so those friendships are real. And, one of my other translators, his name's Osama, he lives in Orlando. And like we talked also recently, like a couple weeks ago. So, it's just, I think that I wanted to tell that story. That people named Ala and Osama were just like, just like we felt during September 11th. We, had this attack happen that destroyed, these two iconic buildings in our community. They killed, thousands of people. But, the wars that are going on are also killing, hundreds of thousands of people. And they're real people, too. Just like those were real people to us. Those are real landmarks. The feelings we felt, that's what they're feeling every day. And so I wanted to communicate that.
So you stayed in the Middle East for a little while, though, right? Not just in Iraq. You've moved around. You've been in Lebanon and some other parts of the Middle East.
I lived there for 6 years. And I was based in Iraq for 2 years, and then I was based out of Lebanon for 4. Okay. And I traveled.
Beirut?
Yeah, in Beirut.
Okay.
and which was basically the Miami of the Middle East. And
I've never heard that. But,
it totally is. It definitely is. It's
during the drug era, or just
just in general. Like the
Okay.
women there are like stilettos and
Really?
look amazing, and
Wow.
everyone's like at 8:00 in the morning looks like they just walked out of like a fashion shoot. So, and the food's amazing, and it's a lot of fun. Beirut's actually a really fun city.
Is it? I mean, is it as dangerous as people say? At the same time, you have all this beauty and fun and cosmopolitan behavior, but were you ever afraid? Were you ever in a situation where you felt as if you were unsafe or unwelcomed?
Not unwelcome. I mean, definitely I didn't feel unwelcome. But, I mean, I was there in 2006 when Israel, and Hezbollah went to war. And that was, you could hear bombs dropping and, our windows shook. So, I mean, and I covered that conflict. But I don't know. It's one of those things, like when you're in a conflict, you're in a really dangerous situation, it usually seems pretty okay until it's not.
Yeah.
I mean, that's really the reality of it. I mean, but there are certain ways to kind of to take more calculated, risks and understand where it is more dangerous than other places.
And so how do you prepare yourself for something like that? I mean, do you go in with just kind of a sense of optimism? Are you always on guard? Do you understand that you're there as press to tell a story and anticipate that you're going to be seen as that? Or is there always kind of, a sixth sense that you kind of have to continually tap into, knowing that you're kind of in a place that's not necessarily inherently welcoming to Westerners?
I mean, I will say that, so when I was there from 2002, more or less, till 2008, in the Middle East. And
It's right after 9/11.
Yeah. But I wasn't there when there was like, when ISIS was kind of doing, the things that were, beheading people in Syria and things like that. I will say I generally felt pretty welcome in both countries, and I worked all throughout the Middle East, and I would say they really, ISIS aside, most people understood the difference because many of them lived under bad governments, understood that maybe the decisions that our governments were making at the time didn't reflect the people who were coming to tell these stories. So there was a sophistication there that I wasn't, most of the time was not lumped in with the American policies. American foreign policy.
Now, you obviously cover a lot of subject matter that's gender sensitive, right? Around women's rights or the lack thereof, or how women are being treated around the world. Did the inspiration to start, capturing that content come from your time in the Middle East? Because obviously it's known that women's rights there are kind of non-existent.
Well, actually, it kind of came from my mom's upbringing. My mom was really not encouraged to go to school. She was not, her second husband was, he was violent with her, and we had, my family's from Alabama, so I was raised with a lot of crazy stuff, and so I was able to see kind of how, when my mom wanted to go to school, her family actively said, absolutely not. Who do you think you are? Women don't get educated. And then what I saw when I went to the Middle East and when I was working in places like Afghanistan was kind of a reflection of kind of the extreme case of what my mom was facing. So I always brought the experiences I was witnessing, I personalized them and made them really tried to see just how, there before the grace of God go us, that we didn't end up in a situation born in the birth lottery somewhere else, that, at least that it was a right to put children in school and have them, it was compulsory to have them go through, at least 16 years old. And my mom was able to be part of the women's movement, as she grew up through the 70s, 60s and 70s, and she had the confidence to demand to go back to school no matter what her family said. And then I watched in other places in the world where women just weren't, those rights, those movements for their rights hadn't really they needed so much more support. And I felt like, as the child of a very strong woman who was very independent and felt confident to go pursue my dreams to the nth degree, that it was my responsibility to then help those women and girls around the world and enable them to do the same.
So why Too Young to Wed, right? That's the work that I was introduced to you through. The stuff obviously stopped me in my tracks when I looked at your work, and just couldn't believe that I was ignorant to this, right? That this was going on, that 12-year-old girls were being kind of forced into marriage, and probably even someone younger than that were being forced into marrying, middle-aged men. And I'm not sure if this was your first foray into kind of a gender-sensitive issue like that. But why? What were you exposed to that made you say, I have to document this?
There was a very specific instance. I was in Afghanistan, and I was assigned to go photograph girls who'd set themselves on fire, and this was in Herat, Afghanistan. And it was just it was kind of a phenomenon, but they didn't really know why it was happening. They just heard that several girls were doing this in the this northern province. And so I traveled there, and I met all these girls, and there's one girl in specific. Her name was Marzia, and she was married when she was just 9 years old, and she was 15 when I met her, and she'd basically tried to commit suicide because she broke her husband's television set. And that obviously you don't do something like that unless you have so much fear of what the repercussion of that is going to be. And so I found out that when I spoke to, there's about, I would say, 8 girls who had set themselves on fire, and about half of them were married really young. And I didn't understand that girls even got married that young. And but the girls that I spoke to were married at 9, 10, 11, and really they were committing suicide over continuing to be in the lives that they were living. But you can't report on something that's dramatic without kind of looking at the root causes. And so I did research. I did research on child marriage, and really noticed that there were no photographs about it. There was some research done by several nonprofits and aid organizations, but there were no good photographs. They were just kind of smiling girls with it, and I knew that there was space there to make photographs that showed what would lead to this. And so I started working on that in Afghanistan, and have expanded that project to about 10 countries now, just photography-wise. It's actually an issue in more than 50 countries around the world.
Wow. I want to show you a couple of pictures, and I want you to kind of give the viewers some context into what's happening. So this first one is looks like a newlywed couple that's just been married, and they're sitting down on a rug. But as you can see, the girl looks like she's 10 years old or younger. Can you give us some insight into what was happening there?
Yeah, absolutely. So that young girl, she was actually 11, so it's very close. And that was actually the first time she'd ever met that was her fiance at the time, but that was the first time they'd ever met. And he was clearly decades older than her. And, I asked her, I said, what do you think is what's your life going to be like? How are you feeling today? And she just looked at me very seriously and said, how do you think I feel? And
how do the men respond when you're taking a picture? They just think this is
they just don't see anything wrong with it.
Yeah.
I will say that there were 2 cousins that I photographed during the same trip to Afghanistan, 2 cousins, and at separate locations. And one of the other girls' father told me you could tell he was a little bit ashamed, and he said, "You think I want to marry my daughter off at this age?" He's like, but they were in such a rural area that he said, we can't feed the children we have. And so
they're selling the daughters off, essentially.
In fact, that's exactly what her mother said. She said, well, I'm selling my daughter off. And that's basically the biggest problem, and why I chose to continue working on the issue of child marriage, because child marriage is one of those things where it's kind of the best example of where a girl is really the biggest problem girls have, and is that they're valued really for their bodies. They're valued for sexuality, they're valued for fertility, and they're valued for labor. And labor that happens like after marriage commonly, of like cleaning the house, working in the field, doing everything. Yeah. But they're not valued for their spirits, their intellect. And so really, and the other thing that I learned is that if we could raise the age of marriage, then girls would be subjected to less domestic violence because they would be respected more. They would stay in school longer. They would be healthier during childbirth. A lot of times when they give birth, when they're so young, their hips aren't wide enough, so they have obstructed labor. They die, and their kids die during childbirth. So there's so many issues that happen that are related to this issue that I felt that if my goal was really to protect girls' rights and to help girls around the world, that this was one of those root cause issues that would address all of these topics.
Wow. So, abuse is obviously something that you take seriously as well. I mean, you talked a little bit about your personal experience with your mom. And one of the photos that I found extremely compelling was a young girl who's on the roof bathing, but you can see that she's been literally burned with acid. So, and this is not just a one-time freak occurrence. It seems like acid is a tool of choice to inflict, I don't know if it's punishment, discipline, or whatever it is on young girls. I mean, what's that about? I mean, I can't even imagine. I can't even find the words to kind of articulate, what because it just sounds so absurd. Yeah. But it seems to be something that's commonly practiced.
It's very much meant to disfigure girls and women who it happens to, and it's meant to humiliate them permanently. It's like one of those "if I can't have you, nobody can" kind of situations. And so, yeah, I mean,
are these girls being rebellious? Are they, saying, hey, I don't want to be married? Are they demanding a divorce and this happens? I mean, what could potentially trigger something like this?
Acid attacks happen for a lot of different reasons. And actually, they don't happen just to women, but they do primarily happen to women. It is a very cruel way to exact revenge. And so, basically, one of the common reasons this happened is a girl rebuffing a guy in some way. So Ritu, who's in that photograph, she was a star volleyball player. She was very into her athletics, and her cousin wanted to marry her, and she was still in high school. And she said no. She wasn't interested. And so he burned her with acid. And the cool part is that Ritu now works at a cafe called Shiro's Cafe. It's actually right across, very close to the Taj Mahal in Agra, India. And she uses her time to educate tourists about acid attacks. And they're trying to kind of make it more difficult for people to get acid, to make it punishments more severe for those who use this form of attacking women.
Because in the picture, she actually looks like she's jubilant a little bit, like she's actually at peace. And I don't know if it's because she's found a purpose. What's her mindset now? Is it because she's found this purpose through this tragedy that she looks like she's still trying to move forward and enjoy life?
Absolutely. I mean, she is. I found most of the girls were quite resilient. I mean, it's a brutal thing that happens, and she's been through 7 surgeries. She has a prosthetic eye.
How old was she when this happened?
I think she was 17. And but she's a tough girl. She's a tough cookie, and she's confident, and I think she has found a lot of healing through the cafe and through sharing her story. And what was so beautiful is, so I had photographed at the cafe, and it was one of those photographer moments where you feel like, oh, you know, I've spent all this time with them. I think I've got what I need, but I'm just going to hang out a little bit longer. So it was monsoon season. It had been raining, and the light was crap. And I was just like, just hanging out with them, really. And then she's like, I think we're going to go bathe on the roof. You want to come? And I was like, yeah, I want to go. That's amazing. And so they went upstairs, she and one of the other girls, and they just stood there in the rain and were just like dancing in the rain and just being bathed. And in fact, for me as well, it was like just spending all this time working on all these really difficult stories. It was such a beautiful, cathartic moment of just being cleansed by nature and by the healing powers of just being on the right side of history and fighting for good and not being, you know, dissuaded no matter what comes your way.
That's awesome. That's awesome. Now, this last photo I want to show you, I mean, we're all familiar with Boko Haram and what's going on in Nigeria. A few years ago, Bring Our Girls Back, we saw that massive group of young women, Nigerian women, who were kidnapped. There's reports now that they've been freed. But you have these 3 girls here that obviously have been, they were either sold or kidnapped by Boko Haram. I mean, first of all, how did you even find these girls? And tell us a little bit about their story and maybe give a little insight into kind of what's going on in Nigeria with this particular group that a lot of people don't know a lot about.
I'm glad you asked. So those girls are 3 sisters who were all kidnapped. They were abducted by Boko Haram out of their village. And the girl in the middle, her name's Yakaka, and she's like, looks like she could, you can't really tell from that photograph, but she looks like a runway model. She's incredibly beautiful. And the fighters came in and they said, they were taking over the village, and they said, I want to marry your daughter. And the fighters came in and told her, I want to marry you. And she said, absolutely not. And he goes, and she was like, my parents won't let you anyway. He goes, okay, well, I'll kill them, and then they'll let me marry you. Then I can marry you. And she's like, okay, wait, okay, I'll just marry you, fine. And so that's how she ended up marrying them. And not only was she married to them, but she was, you know, forced to have a baby who was stillborn. So because she escaped and couldn't care for the baby, and when she was pregnant, and she ended up with a stillborn child. Wow. So the girls that I met in Nigeria are some of the toughest things I've ever witnessed in like 20 years of doing this. And the girls,
they look so stoic. They look so strong in spite of having to deal with such tragedy. I mean, where do they find that strength?
Well, that was what was so beautiful, is that, like, so Yakaka, I asked her, I said, well, what do you want? Like, you've been through this crazy, unimaginable ordeal, something that nobody can even fathom what you've been through. And what do you want? What do you want the world? She goes, I just want to go to school. Like, that's what she wanted. I just want to go to school. So my organization, Too Young to Wed, obviously we gave her a scholarship and put her back in school. But the thing is, you know, and I'm glad you bring up the Bring Back Our Girls campaign, because even though there were 276 girls who were abducted from a Christian school, but officials there say that, you know, they think that the words that the Nigerian official told me is that Boko Haram girls are only 0.1% of the amount of girls who've been abducted by Boko Haram. So they believe there's tens of thousands of girls still missing that people aren't looking for. And I think in part, you know, it's a touchy subject, but in part because it's mostly Muslim girls. Yeah. It's also because they're African girls. And it's in an area where people don't want to deal with the Boko Haram situation. They don't know how to handle it. But truthfully, this is where you're seeing child marriage being used as a weapon of war. And, you know, these girls are being forced to give birth to children who then will be trained to be fighters for Boko Haram. And it is, for me, it's the most urgent issue I've covered in my whole life, because I feel like we will lose a generation of girls, and not just girls, but we will allow this indoctrination of all these children if we don't put pressure on the Nigerian government to start rescuing some of these girls.
Now, a lot of people think, the Nigerian government is very apathetic to this. And they're not doing enough. They could be doing more. Aside from, the media and sensationalizing this issue in the media, bringing it to people's attention, what can people do to help persuade them to get more involved in protecting these girls?
I think there needs to be another Bring Back Our Girls campaign. It just needs to be bring back all our girls. I mean, there's tens of thousands of girls missing. But, I think that people don't relate as much because they weren't Christian girls. And I think there's a lot of fear, because of terrorism. But I really think that it's urgent. And the Bring Back Our Girls campaign was really helpful, and it did put pressure on. And when I spoke to the Nigerian officials, they told me, the pressure is on us to find the Chibok girls. So we are finding them, and now most of them are released. There needs to be pressure for all the girls that are missing. And we can do that. We just have to kind of figure out and mobilize to do it.
Well, content just plays such a big part. To your earlier point about us being in such a visual age, is the government being open to letting journalists and storytellers come into their country to try and tell stories around this so that people can become educated and become more involved? Or are they, because to some degree, this is kind of a blemish on their face, right? So is there a reluctancy, or are they actually being, involved and open in allowing storytellers like yourself to come in there and kind of illuminate this issue globally?
I think, the girls aren't that hard to find. They're living in the host community. They're living in the city of Madaguri. They're not even in the IDP camps. So they weren't that hard to find. I think it's just a matter, you just have to go to Madaguri, you have to get a visa to go. Yeah. But there are plenty of journalists who go. It is somewhat dangerous because it's a bit of an unstable area. But I don't think it's the journalists. The New York Times, our project was published in the New York Times. And the Times has since done several stories. I think that there's some stories that are being done, but there needs to be, I think, more kind of collective campaigns that need to happen that are not reliant on individual one story published here and there, but like mobilization of people.
What I notice is that there's a media life cycle to like every campaign once something happens, right? And then once it's not news anymore, the NGOs or the special interest groups or even the celebrities who get out in front of something when it's relevant, they start to kind of move on and they start to look for other kind of flags to wave or other things to kind of get involved with. All right, I checked that box, I did this, I kind of, invested my time in raising awareness about this current issue. We're seeing the same thing happen in Flint, Michigan right now, and people are still drinking toxic water, right?
It's insane.
And it's insane, and the government is talking about it's going to take 3 years to change all the pipes in people's homes. We as private citizens have the ability to change the pipes in their homes now, just like we have the ability to put greater pressure on the Nigerian government to bring more girls home now. It's just about consistency and choosing to kind of be committed to a specific issue versus one that just happens to be the story of the day. I'm not sure who is going to catalyze that. And, you had someone like Michelle Obama, who is, one of my superheroes. Do people like that have to be more consistent? Do they have to kind of stay more committed to a narrative that they kind of begin?
I don't know. I think this is your expertise. This is your area of expertise because I'm kind of a content gatherer. I don't really have, I don't know. It's not my expertise to how to develop a campaign, but I think we need more people like like the work that you guys do, and to get behind some of these issues that haven't been out there as much. The biggest issue is what's happening politically in the U.S. is there's so many issues right now, and people are kind of rightfully freaking out about losing so many rights, just even healthcare, all kinds of different things. So it's kind of a difficult time to get people interested in what's happening in northern Nigeria. But I that situation is really really critical. And I think there's nowhere in the world that we would be okay with tens of thousands of girls being abducted and forced in, to have sex with these guys and bear their children. And girls told me crazy stories about being threatened that they would intimidate them from leaving because by burning one of their other girls in front of them and threatening, this will happen to you if you leave. If you attempt, if we catch you, you're going to be set on fire in front of the rest of your friends. It's the worst stuff I've ever heard in 20 years.
Wow.
And people don't understand how bad it is. And so I'm all ears.
Yeah. I mean, I get frustrated sometimes because I do think that there are individuals like you who are so committed to a cause and seeing it all the way through. And then what we're seeing in the U.S. particularly is people kind of riding these waves of momentum almost as if social issues are trends, like they're trending topics that we want to attach ourselves to get a little kind of wind in our own sails versus really truly being committed to seeing that cause all the way through to completion. And I think people like you continue to be a beacon and a benchmark to say if we're really going to be activists, which is a term that I think is being thrown around very liberally right now without kind of people understanding the level of commitment that they need to kind of invest in order to kind of create change versus just tweeting something or, making an Instagram post about their commitment to something. There needs to be more of a sustained commitment, right? And our commitment as an agency and working with people like yourself is to figure out how long we can prolong and stretch that narrative as much as we possibly can so that we can get as many people aware and involved as we possibly can. So I don't know if there's not a question at the end of this statement. It's just more of, I think, an observation as to what people need to be doing if they choose to kind of pick up this mantle of activist and want to kind of participate in this dialogue. It can't just be transactional. They have to be committed to kind of long haul. And I'd like to see more of that, and that's kind of what we're committed to in terms of trying to change the sensibility around people so they invest more.
No, absolutely. I mean, I think that I like to think of this as like we're all spokes in a wheel of change. Like I can't do what you do. Or what John does, or but I'm not a politician, and I don't know. I partnered with a group in D.C. to meet with senators and congressmen about what was happening in Nigeria. But but I couldn't do that without their help. Like we're spokes in a wheel, and if we all use our abilities to do what we can do, we move. Yeah. And we'll see this change happen. And it's just a matter of kind of, like you said, focusing on an issue and keeping with it until it goes. I mean, that's why I've been working on the same project for 15 years.
So you spoke a little bit about sending this lovely girl to school. So talk to me a little bit about, is there a foundation connected with what you do? And so tell us a little bit about that and the work that foundation does.
So to kind of address the needs of some of the girls that we were meeting, that I've been meeting in the field for all this time. Myself and those closest to me started an organization called Too Young to Wed, based after the project, and we had an international traveling exhibition as part of that. And it's part of it is our mission is to protect girls' rights and end child marriage, but part of it is creating this work. It's going out and finding underreported stories related to girls' issues and child marriage in particular and disseminating it widely. And then it's also on-the-ground support for girls. In the case, I met about 25 girls and a couple boys who were child soldiers, actually, that one of the girls rescued and when she was escaping. And so we gave all of them scholarships. And we hold photography workshops that are girl empowerment / photography workshops. And the idea is that they learn to take their own photographs. They talk about their experiences and find bonding and community with each other. And then their photographs of each other then are disseminated again through the media and different outlets. So they can share their story in their own words, in their own photographs. And it keeps getting the message out in a different way. So,
Awesome.
so that's basically what we do. Is we kind
Is there a website? Is it tooyoungtowed.com?
.org.
.org. Awesome. So you've been published everywhere: Nat Geo, New York Times, Newsweek. You know, what's next? What's kind of? I mean, obviously you're Too Young to Wed, and that whole project for you is ever present and evergreen. But is there any other kind of projects that you're working on right now that we should know about?
Yeah, so I have the Too Young to Wed exhibition is there's a major exhibition on the whole top floor of the Arch de la Défense in Paris, which will run from June 15th through the end of September. And actually June 1st, but the opening is actually June 15th where I'll be there. And so that's pretty amazing. It's 160 photographs, it's 6 films, and it chronicles kind of all of the lives of all the girls that I've met throughout these years. And then
And when's that happening?
This June through September.
All right, awesome.
And then we're going to continue doing our workshops. We're going to do a workshop with the girls in Nigeria. We're going to do a workshop with the acid survivors in India. So those are our next 2 workshops that we'll be doing. And other than that, I mean, I'm a new mom, so I stay at home, kind of working working on this stuff behind the scenes at this time.
Awesome. Well, look, I'm Joe Anthony. This is Stephanie Sinclair, and she's definitely a hero. Thank you so much, Stephanie, for coming.
Thank you for having me, Joe. Appreciate
Absolutely.
it. It's really a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much.
Work. Thank you.